Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's the Witch of Contradiction 4-.2, something to do. These Parley are often about Pathfinder mechanics as well as an ongoing discussion of a very complicated to understand the context of character build that EyePatchNotes has brewed up, the Witch of Contradiction. We're getting fairly close to being at a point where we're discussing the build, like what the build is. We're talking about mechanics of the character. So a lot of this is a window into why somebody would find it enjoyable to make a build like this, different quirks of these systems and how you can leverage them to be enjoyable. And to me, a lot of this parlay ends up being also about what about this system makes it fun to make builds like this. So some intro stuff, and a lot of technical things. You might enjoy listening to it. Welcome aboard. EyePatchNotes begins. I'm experimenting with a bit of flagging where an ace mark, like in playing cards, an ace, a spade, indicates that I've changed something about the first party text, or I have something to add. Technically, everything I quote uses a halfway house between Pathfinders and 5th edition's more familiar wording to me. But for the first part summary, teamwork feats we're going to talk about in this parlay need to be present on 2 or more characters, and then they work for both of them. They may have further requirements, but a subset of them overlap with other systemic clauses like flanking. You might need other things in your build or active to use a teamwork feat, but sometimes those other things are not other things you need to put in your build, like they're just things that you can do in Pathfinder. So a teamwork feat might need to be on you and a teamwork buddy. We'll get to it in a few minutes, and might require other things to work, but those things might be like flanking. You just can do flanking in Pathfinder. You don't have to get another feat that is flanking. Attacking as a bonus action is considered very powerful in this system and is gated behind additional actions. The attack may be restricted to specific weapons too. Considered very powerful by the system, meaning it is somewhat objectively very powerful. You know, to fully attack in Pathfinder, is it literally called full attack? To attack more than once, to multi-attack, you not need to move very much on your turn. You only get a 5-foot step. So if you need to move significantly to catch up to someone, you generally can only attack once, which might have various restrictions. You won't do as much damage. Yeah. So being able to do that as a bonus action is great. It means you could be more mobile while still attacking multiple times, various combinations of things. Some teamwork feats have very steep prerequisites, but certain items, spells, or classes can skip those prerequisites or offer an alternative. That'll come up. And for emphasis, moving actions to different speeds, like making something that would normally require an action a bonus action, is not the be-all end-all. Some bonus actions are only taken once per combat, so the character is at risk of running out of things to do with their bonus action, without further consideration at least. For example, let's say you need to turn something on by doing a bonus action attack. Well, you want to make sure you have things to do in that action slot after you've done the thing you needed to turn on, or that you have other bonus actions worth doing, or that attacking every turn with that bonus action is good. You know, moving things to, in theory, better, less expensive parts of your turn in our little model of the bucket of action economy in Pathfinder is good usually, yes, but you do need to harness that value in some way. One of the cool things about this build setup is that you have a very clever way of harnessing that potential. So lots of action economy discussion here. We're going to come back to a little bit about this later, but to finish this section, to further drive home the point, since mounted combat didn't make it this month, snapping flank, a teamwork feat we're going to work on, is available on all qualified bodies. If the rider can bite as a bonus action, so can the mount. Hex Strike, which we talked about in a previous parlay, thus represents 1 bonus action once per target, while Snapping Flank represents 2 bonus actions nearly every turn. You can just keep doing it for damage. For the purposes of this parlay, please assume that the witch has a flanking engine. Yes, we're assuming that you have a way to flank built in. It's pretty clear what it is. We'll talk about it later. The idea is, and we're going to talk about it more during this parlay, the snapping flank feat over here. I particularly like this teamwork graphic, by the way. I think that's cool. Gives you the ability to do bite actions. But remember, it's a teamwork feat, so both you and the mount in this case, but the ally to your team working with, will be able to do this every round. And so not only does this give you the ability to hit with an attack if an ability asks you to do that faster with a bonus action than you otherwise would be able to, it also allows you and your team working ally, mount in this case, to both attack as a bonus action every single round, which just like does things anyway. It might make it easier to do something as an action that would have been harder to set up before, but it also just makes sure you still have value in that slot. So yeah, rather than using Hex Strike, which was one way to, fill the bonus action slot, we now have a way to permanently get value out of bonus actions. Just as an aside, I also think that bonus actions like this tend to be valuable in a way where it's like most of the time you'll do them, but then you don't feel too bad if you don't use them either. We're going to talk later in this parlay about things that don't cost resources. I think it can be really frustrating when you frequently have a bonus action slot you can fill, but it might cost a resource to, be filling it every time, or it costs a resource to do something else, thus giving your bonus action slot kind of an opportunity cost in and of itself. It's nice when it's just like you gain the ability to attack as a bonus action. You don't feel too bad if now and again you do something else as a bonus action, but you always have something to reach for value in that slot, especially with the setup you have. Like you need you and your snapping flank ally to be flanking, which normally it would be like, yeah, you could in theory do that every round, but you have to like be flanking to do it every round. You have a clever solution to make this work out more easily. Okay, moving on to the body of the parlay. Pathfinder's teamwork feats are an interesting bunch. Yes, they are so far. This is a cool concept. I want this in my tabletop role-playing games. 2 characters need to both possess a given teamwork feat before worrying about any prerequisites or activation requirements they may have. One of the said activation requirements is flanking, in the case of snapping flank, a systemic clause that all characters pay no resource to benefit from. Yeah, you just can flank in Pathfinder. Many teamwork feats thus ask only for prerequisites and the feat slots across 2 likely player-owned bodies. Such teamwork feats impose no additional action costs if the player was already interested in flanking. 5th edition's flanking carries a runaway benefit, attacks taking the better of 2 rolls until flanking ends. You get advantage when you flank by default. Mathfinder flanking provides a more modest +2, while priming any teamwork feats the characters may possess. Yeah, just as an aside, it's incredibly common, like probably one of the most common homebrews, to make 5th edition's flanking be only +2, or +2 for each flanking member. Like if you get a 3rd person, maybe you get +4. I've seen that quite a lot as well. 5th edition flanking with advantage is, in my opinion, way, way too strong. If your party uses any strategy whatsoever, it's just overpowered. For some groups, maybe it's no big deal. I think that's great. If you currently give flanking as advantage, I would just be ready to change it if your players actually get used to using it. It's much easier to balance if you make it the much more reasonable +2. +2 is still really good, but advantage that's insane. Like there's a lot of reasons why that's really strong. Crits, among other things. Anyway, yes, in Pathfinder, this is just the rule, not an entirely uncommon trend in Pathfinder, that a very common, very sensible homebrew for D&D is just the way it works in Pathfinder. The Witch of Contradiction employs one of the most premium feats on offer, Snapping Flank. So we're going to read what it is now. I'll read it here again as well. I'll leave it up here for you. So it's a combat feat. It's a teamwork feat. Prerequisites are martial score +9, although there's that spade, that ace mark there. That means it isn't really martial score +9. That's just a lie to make things easier for me to understand because I've played mostly 5th edition. And you need to have a bite attack. You need to be able to have a bite attack. Just by the way, so like if you and your companion... Okay, hold on. Whenever you're flanking with an ally who also has this feat, as a bonus action, you can make a bite attack against the opponent you and your ally are flanking. Okay, so my question is maybe kind of obvious. So we're riding something that we're going to get to allow flanking in a minute. The thing I'm riding is maybe a crocodile, let's say, just for the sake of discussion. Yeah, it definitely has a bite attack. I am a witch. Let's imagine a crone, an aged human lady. Do I have a bite attack? I can bite the enemy. I mean, I could. Does that count? Can I just kind of like what qualifies as having a bite attack? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It kind of matters. Generating an attack as a bonus action speed is a powerful effect. The hurtful feat described last time requires the characters to intimidate the target within the same turn, notably normally a standard action to intimidate. Snapping flank is even faster than hurtful, albeit limited to bite attacks and with steep prerequisites. At martial score +9, the way you get more like the equivalent of martial score +9 in Pathfinder, the earliest a flank-interested rogue or druid, not full martial characters, could qualify is 13th level, given martial score scaling of 0.75, and that 12th level does not normally grant a feat slot. More damningly, animal companions have a martial score scaling of 0.6, and would next gain a feat slot at companion level 16. If we want to get snapping flank anywhere close to its stated unlock at 9th level, we need to cheat. To explain a little bit more what's going on, not only do you need your martial score to be +9, and in Pathfinder, different classes have different amounts of martial score scaling. So, for example, a fighter or whatever they're called in Pathfinder probably has 1.0 scaling. Every level they get one martial score. So it would be at level 9. But rogue and druid are 0.75, so they need to be level 12 or 13 instead. The additional levels sometimes come from the fact that you have to have the martial score at that appropriate level, but you also need to gain the feat once you have a high enough martial score to be able to get the feat. So if the feat requires martial score +9, you have to get martial score +9, level 12, but then you don't get a feat at level 12, so you need to wait until also, again, the next time you get a feat, the 13th level, I suppose. As a recap, EyePatchNotes includes Pathfinder grants universal feat slots at every odd level. The character can take any feat they qualify for, but will frequently miss timing on exact prerequisites due to martial score or like needing other feats to be able to take a feat, right? Which is largely what's happening here. Okay, and so there's a little addendum about how we're getting the ability to flank. So what we want to do is use snapping flank, and later we're going to use that ability to hit as a bonus action to apply some other stuff, some hex shenanigans. But it says while you are flanking with an ally that also has this feat, as a bonus action you can make a bite against them if you're flanking them. Well, but you won't be flanking with them because you're riding a crocodile in my example. You and the crocodile are both in the same direction with, whatever your target is, right? However, there is a cheatsy solution to this problem, and it is the Blades Above and Below. What a badass name. Another teamwork feat. EyePatchNotes continues, for another example of a teamwork feat, one not covered in the main parlay, but one which this build possesses, consider Blades Above and Below. With a martial score prerequisite of +6, it's just accessible enough without shenanigans at Animal Companion level 10. Mind that the same stipulations in Addendum 2 apply. Flimsy feat inheritance may not allow a familiar to truly count as having the teamwork feat. This is where the witch tip comes in handy. Besides turning on hinder in the first place, one witch subclass is the beast bonded witch. Its primary benefit is sacrificing one of the witch's feat slots to their familiar, bypassing the restriction that the familiar cannot learn feats directly. Yes, the character ends up spending 2 feat slots to establish flanking, but this is a worthy payoff. Well, you establish 2 feats to establish Blades Above and Below flanking, and then also 2 more feats to establish snapping flank, but you have a trick later. We'll get to it later. Now, the reason that you can use the trick of Beast Bonded Witch for Blades Above and Below to get flanking online is because it doesn't require as high of a martial score. So you can have your animal companion be level 10, and with 0.6 scaling, they have exactly martial score 6, which is what Blades Above and Below requires. Because snapping flank requires martial score +9, you can't use the same thing. You would have to wait much longer to get it, as we established earlier. So we're going to cheat that one in some way that we'll talk about in a minute. But then the ability to get flanking, you've got a different solution. I just wanted to pause to point out there are many different shenanigans that you need to get through to, like achieve this. A lot of it is very satisfying in a way I can relate to a lot, making builds where it's like anything could make this fall apart. You know what I mean? Like if the requirement for blades above and below was a little higher, but should it be that much higher? All it does is allow you and a differently sized ally to threaten the same enemy and flank them, even if you're not like flanking them, like on other sides of them. You can be facing the same way, like riding on the ally. And then the target has to be the same size as you or your ally. There's a little note down here that I need more room. Because it says you have to be the same size as them, and you and your ally have to be different sizes, you also kind of inherently cover two size classes. If you are, I actually don't remember which sizes you recommend as being good, but like if you were, medium and your mount large, or small and medium, then you threaten like many of the common sizes of enemy all at once. So while it does have a restriction on size, you can't use it against, a huge target probably. It is still pretty flexible. Yeah, that's cool. I somewhat missed Addendum 2 in order. You had a little thing that said what order to read these in, but I'm going to come back to Addendum 2 later. It doesn't say to read Addendum 2 now, and I don't think we should read Addendum 2 now, but I'm sorry, it was confusing that I mentioned it before. Okay, let's get back to how we're going to get snapping flanks. So we found a way to just get the math to work out that at a level 10 animal companion, you can get blades above and below. They have exactly 6 martial score. Beast Bonded Witch, you can send the feat slot to the familiar so they can get it. But then, to get snapping flank on the familiar, we need the Ring of Tactical Precision, a magical item that sponges a teamwork feat from its first bearer to imbue onto the second. We have some landmines to discuss in the sidebar. Yeah, we'll get to them later. But this will handily get the Witch's Bat on board for shenanigans. Recall that blood hexes require the character to deal damage to an enemy before they can become targets for the blood hex. Blood Hex Strike takes the approach of dealing damage at normal speed, a standard action, before applying a blood hex at super speed, bonus action. The way we're going to do it is Snapping Flank, instead damaging the target at super speed, bonus action, before applying a blood hex at normal speed, standard action. One of the core conflicts here, not a contradiction yet, it's coming, this resolves is consistently giving the witch something to do. Speeding up the application of hexes would be well and good, but that represents one swift action per target over the course of a combat. Making single punches is also not a productive use of a standard action. In the context of Mathfinder, standard actions are the second most costly thing to do in a player's turn with power to match. Using Snapping Flank as a bonus action, instead, frees up the witch to use her standard action for any mechanic she has access to. Right, so this is kind of the thing I mentioned earlier, where because you've confabulated this situation where we can repeatedly attack as a bonus action to trigger blood hexes in general, so we need to have done damage that turn. Because that's being achieved as a bonus action, instead of inflicting the hex as a bonus action, it's the standard action on your turn that is left free. In fact, let's switch back to the previous image. And because you have your standard action free, you can like cast a spell or, I don't know, like do basically whatever you want, rather than needing to find something that would have fit a bonus action. It's kind of better for the flex slot to be a standard action, a more flexible slot. Yeah, cool. Okay. And now the big kicker, Snapping Flank's partner in crime is the Hinder blood hex. So what are we using Snapping Flank to hurt the enemy with a bonus action and then use an action to inflict? What is the debuff we're going to use? Hinder. This is a blood hex. It requires intelligence score of 13. As a standard action, this has a spade and ace next to it. You can curse an enemy you've damaged with a melee attack in the last minute to become hesitant. The target must succeed at a dexterity save or take a -10 penalty on any initiative check it makes in the next minute. That sounds absolutely terrible. Hold on. Special. If a witch uses this blood hex, the target is unable to take a full attack action for 1 round, and that can be extended with the Cackle hex. Here we can see the stark difference between witches and non-witches. For most characters, how exactly would the player deal melee damage without the game master asking for initiative rolls? The game state would have to be very, very specific to resolve as written. Rejected, unsubscribed. Now the witch effect, though, is very interesting. Brief tangent, witch hexes from witch levels are almost exclusively intelligence-based, and Hinder does ask for intelligence 13. However, blood hexes have smart DCs as part of their reputedly class-agnostic nature. Because hexes are designed to technically be available for everybody, not just for witches, even though, as we just established, they're like kind of terrible if they're not used by witches. But because they are designed that way, they have smart DCs calculated using the highest of the character's intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, rather than a set stat. You would expect it to be intelligence. Mathfinder only has 3 save types compared to D&D's 6. This is weird, I had never heard of this. Only Constitution, Wisdom, and Dexterity saves. Constitution, you die if you fail or watch your allies die. You get disabled. Wisdom, you die if you fail, or you attack your allies, you get mind controlled. And Dexterity, you fail, you take some damage. Not a big deal. High Wisdom is then preferable to High Intelligence. Blood Hex Smart DCs allow the character to bolster their important Wisdom save while still increasing Blood Hex success rate. Note further that Hinder calls for a Dexterity save, given that bestiary entries, the enemies you'll be fighting, tend to prioritize Constitution and Wisdom saves. Hinder is much more consistent by proxy, made more consistent by proxy. So, our long-discussed Witch of Contradiction, taking both Snapping Flank and Hinder, thus makes for a potent MMO-style tank. Approach the enemy to flank because of Blades Above and Below. Snapping Flank to draw blood, that way you can do a Hex this turn, and it's a bonus action. Hinder them as your standard action for the turn. Then Cackle all the way to the bank. The target has 1 chance to resist the Blood Hex or lose the ability to take multiple attacks while the Witch so laughs. While in incomplete defense, like Hinder has no effect on enemy casters, enemy full attacks are one of the primary occupational hazards for a melee character. More so in the early turns of combat, where enemies are at their most numerous and the battle could go either way. Hinder is still only part of the Witch's tanking package, though. Next time, maybe, finally, we can pursue her greatest contradiction. And I look forward to it, but I have a lot of notes to add. This was confusing at first to me, but eventually very satisfying to see the entire machine come together. And I really enjoy these kinds of things. Like, it's often described as a sort of Rube Goldberg machine when you make a build like this, where, you know, you don't want to hit an enemy unless it's at the end of some confabulated contraption where you do something awful to them at the end, or a ton of once per turn damage effects go off or something. Pretty interesting, and definitely a flavor of character building that 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons shares. It's often very beneficial to hit someone a little bit or to maximize your attack output, but not so much to do like a normal number of attacks. Like there's not a lot of as powerful effects in there. Finding a way to get an attack in and then you do something else versus you do like find a way to get as many attacks in as possible can both be pretty powerful, and it's interesting to see the kind of debuff payoff that you get here. I have a lot of notes, though. One of the first ones is something that seems good about this to me that didn't come up yet in this parlay. It's possible you're just planning to talk about it later. And it's that it seems to me that you can also move freely while attacking and doing your standard action after you set this up. And so, like, looking at your bucket of actions here, to set up the thing, we described it before, you get in range, use Snapping Flank because you and your mount count as flanking even though you're in the same place because of Blades Above and Below. You do a bonus action attack, your mount does a bonus action attack, I suppose. Take a chomp out of them. Standard action, you use Hinder, hopefully it succeeds. Then on future turns, you have Snapping Flank all the time because you're riding your flanking partner. And Blades Above and Below. And you can use your standard action to cackle and maintain the Hinder effect. But you can also move, as far as I can tell. You can still use the movement part of your standard action. Since you have the option to do a full attack, or something that might take a full action, I'd imagine there are other things. But you don't need to do that, you're just using a standard action. You still have your movement, you're doing C plus D. You've used B, your bonus action, as well. And so you have the ability to move as well. You get to attack, you get to maintain your debuff, and you stay mobile. So the point is, they're not going to get away. You know, you're very sticky. They're not really able to attack much. They can hit you once maybe, but you can hit them twice and they can't easily get away from you. If they did get away from you, this would stop. You do have to like hit them in melee for this whole thing to work. For hinder, you need to damage them with a melee attack, and your way to do an attack as a bonus action is melee anyway. So if they were to run away successfully, that might be fine. But they would still have the effect for probably one lingering round, and you can move freely during this time. So, yeah, it's just very sticky. That's very cool. But an even bigger thing for me, something I've been very into myself, is a kind of further extension of Buildcraft that I've been getting really into, and I really love to see when it comes up. It is that idea that the player doing this combo can still use all their normal witch stuff. You gained an ability to apply hexes with a much more reasonable blood hexes, with a much more reasonable action economy. But the build primarily does its thing by leaving your action free. You can still do all the normal witch stuff. Too often, I've found that in these tabletop role-playing games, your build achieves something cool, or you get something more like interesting or powerful, but at the expense of the flexibility to do anything normally. The entire build falls apart, or you lose massive value if you don't do like the thing that the build is doing. This is quite the opposite. You can just do whatever you want to do for witch stuff. You know, the enemy dies and you didn't need to debuff them for too long. The build seamlessly goes to continuing snapping flank attacks, and you just like do a normal, you just do some spell casting, you know. That's awesome. Having the synergy enable some special thing, but not disable the ability for you to use other stuff, is not so much powerful. Often that's not the problem, understand. It's just that I think that's really fun. I'm not saying that I think a lot of builds that people discuss theory crafting like are bad because they restrict what you can do. Oftentimes, making this focus build that in this situation does a gajillion attacks in a row or a lot of utility, but then if it isn't in that situation, it loses a lot of value. That's often arguably worth it on paper in terms of power level. I just don't think it's as fun as you could otherwise get it to be. Going further, I think designing a system that is built in a way where you can make something cool but not interrupt like what you would do with your normal turn is particularly valuable. You know, thinking about how you would make that systematically, I don't exactly know. We will be talking about that a little bit more in a minute though, because, as mentioned earlier, one of the ways that this build is achieving its shenanigans is the Ring of Tactical Precision. This is a named magic item, so you might not, like, get it. Before we talk about that, I wanted to briefly include that if you're interested in this idea that I just described and EyePatchNotes just demonstrated, of making a build, allowing players to make builds that don't prevent them from doing the rest of their class stuff, Game Masters, a small suggestion, you could give your players an item that makes a key enabling action on their build be a bonus action some amount of the time. This may allow them to use the other things in their toolkit, a lot of which are probably actions, while still doing the cool combo they had in mind. Many a time, they just need to hit with a setup thing before everything else goes off, and if you simply let that be a different type of action cost, that might be very powerful. You might want to make it so that's restrictive or hard to get in some way, yes. But that might be able to open them up to being able to enjoy their thing they're doing, but not shut off everything else that, you know, the game requires, involves. They might be thinking, you could listen for them thinking, oh, but I have Healing Word to get them up, but I never have room for it. That's actually a bonus action in 5th edition, but you get the example. You know, I have this utility thing I would like to use, but the cool thing I've come up with for my build that I like requires me to do actions in this sequence, which prevents me from having that flexibility. You might be able to simply give them a magic item or homebrew an ability they could study that allows them to do that as the type of action they want to. And that could potentially make playing the character a lot more fun, while not necessarily making them all that much more powerful. It just lets them use their stuff more. It could make them very powerful too. That's, I guess, something to be careful of. Now, on a different note, I wanted to talk about an addendum that you left, EyePatchNotes, about things being like readable or appreciable to other people. This is something that's come up a lot in EyePatchNotes related media, Parley, and also discussions on the Twitch streams. It's come up a lot that you care a lot about other people being able to sort of translate the thing you've made or like the build that you're talking about into their table. Let me read what you wrote and then explain my bent. Addendum 2. While rules lawyering is something I engage in for making my build shareable, like minimizing table variation, this will work at most tables. It is often a joyless thing, I heartily agree. Consider the following text blurbs for an example. Teamwork feats grant large bonuses, but ... require an ally who also possesses the feat to be positioned carefully on the battlefield. Another block of text, ... when the familiar can see and hear its master, it can use any combat feat possessed by the Eldritch Guardian. Another block of text, the Brawler class can take a movement action to gain the benefit of a combat feat she doesn't possess. Brawlers have a potent class feature to arbitrarily gain access to a feat, the aptly named Martial Flexibility. That sounds insanely powerful. However, the strictest reading is that they gain the benefits of the chosen feat, but not the chosen feat itself. The Eldritch Guardian's feat inheritance is also limiting. The familiar can use, while not actually possessing, the fighter's entire feat list. If we assume that teamwork feats effectively ask for a feat in a permanent feat slot, no number of virtual or temporary feats will satisfy the requirement of 2 bodies. Explaining another way, Pathfinder is often very particular about its wording. This is often in conflict across dozens of source books with dozens, ? Of authors. Few mechanics are penned with total awareness of previous books, and Pathfinder 1st edition has about a 10-year run, depending on who you asked. A lot to go through, even while in active publication. So, while the Ring of Tactical Precision is a named magic item, and thus subject to Game Master generosity, they have to let you get it, it is the method you chose to enable this synergy because its specific wording allows the use of teamwork feats without both parties possessing them. The ring says, by wearing the ring for 1 hour, a character may imbue it with a teamwork feat he knows for 24 hours. During this time, a character wearing the ring may use that feat while cooperating with the creature that imbued it, but not with any other creatures, even if they possess the same teamwork feat. Lets you share the teamwork feat. We talked about what it does before. The point is the letter of the law of the text would usually be interpreted as meaning this does work, whereas the letter of the law of a lot of other teamwork feat related rules may not be interpreted as often as allowing this to work. Now, I think this is a really interesting aspect of the discussion. Yeah, I mean, in the first place, you could do, and we have done, and I probably will do again, whole parlays about like whether you ought to just let the player do these things, basically. As a game master, I believe very strongly that if there is a reason not to allow your player to just do the thing, if they've gotten this close to making it work, that player is probably just not fun to play with. And if they are any fun to play with, there isn't much reason not to just let them do this. Like, just let them do it. However, the kind of person who talks about these games on the internet a lot of those people have a tendency to gravitate toward the kinds of people that revel in the ability to be correct, even though I would argue nearly objectively there just isn't any functional single correct definition. Particularly the way EyePatchNotes highlighted, Pathfinder is very particular about its wording, but at the same time, the wording isn't the same particularity across many source materials. This happens all the time in 5th edition too, and I would imagine in many similar games. Players have a tendency to gravitate toward the specific wording and their interpretation of the specific wording, even though, 1, the wording is not specific. It just objectively isn't specific. It's often self-contradictory, or it's just not entirely clear. It depends heavily on your interpretation of what that key word means, and there are several very common interpretations of that word if you don't have your head in the sand. And 2, it's very easy to notice that the source books for that game or whatever are just blatantly not consistent at all. Like they're, this wording is only ever used here. So to say that objectively means this and that's the one meaning is like, no, it's more like they just didn't proofread very carefully. And we know that it's that they didn't proofread very carefully. So in the first place, my humble opinion is that it's just disingenuous for players to act like there is like a single rules as written. I have many times in my time discussing tabletop role playing games, and that hasn't even been that much time. Heard people kind of seen people on the fly trying to make the case for the thing they want to be the rules as written ruling, but which like there's a very clear reason, like it's very reasonable to assume it isn't. Instead of just saying, I think it benefits the fun of the game if we interpret it this way. And it's irrelevant whether that's what the rules say. It is irrelevant if that's what the rules say. And now, EyePatchNotes, don't take me the wrong way. I'm mostly making discussion about what I think is a key point for this build. Are you not trading off enough stuff, like, for it to be a reasonable thing to be able to do? No, it seems like you are. Are you really bending the rules that backwards to get these abilities? Not really. Are any of these wordings extremely unified in their goal of making a certain type of thing universally not allowed? No. Are these particular wordings good at communicating exactly in what way they do and don't allow these mechanics? No. So, in the first place, I find it persnickety that anybody would suggest that it, like, is clearly not allowed to do these things. What I meant before when I said there's really no reason to disallow this unless you have a player that just isn't good to play with in the first place, is that the only good reason, in my opinion, to not let a player do this is if they're trying to fudge the rules to become overpowered in a way that isn't meant to be fun, is just meant to make them take over the game because they want to make other people feel small because they are immature, right? And that's not a good reason to not prevent them from doing this. It's a good reason to kick them out of your game. It's a good reason to not play with them. My opinion is that the core problem here is people settling for bad playgroups, not at all anything about the rules. And if you just play with players that don't suck, there's really no need to be worried about this. EyePatchNotes, on the other hand, I think you are more worried about getting to discuss these things online, hear what other people have to say, or see how other people react, without them shutting down the conversation by saying, oh, but you just can't do that in the rules. I would be interested in suggesting the Ring of Tactical Precision as like a contingency. If you have decided that this interpretation of the rules doesn't work that way, you can use this to, make it unambiguously work in the rules. I guess my 2 cents, which you did not ask for, you paid $9 for me to mostly talk about this parlay, so it really will be only my 2 cents if you average out the amount of time in the video, is that it's pointless. Like you can't make the joyless pedants not be joyless pedants. It's better to just completely abandon any ability to discuss with them, completely abandon discussing these kinds of things in common forums, and instead seek a group of people that won't just shut down the entire discussion with their immaturity. But I completely understand, and I do because we've had previous conversations about this, that you don't see it that way, and that's fine. But just to say, for the audience listening, I would like to politely suggest that you maybe could consider just like, who cares about other people appreciating it? They won't. No matter what you do, they won't. I would almost go so far as to say you're kind of provoking people not interpreting it favorably by trying to offer like an alternate, you know what I mean? I can just see now someone thinking, oh, offering an alternative way to make the build work, it's like they can see you trying to weasel out of that not being how the rules work. It's irrelevant whether it's close enough, and it also just like doesn't, the game is about fun. Like if it's close to how the rules might conceivably work, like the whole benefit of having a game like this is allowing the flexibility. I would hate to see such a fun concept like this be shut down by anyone, a game master or a table, because of a thing that it's almost the definition of this type of game to not have strictly matter. Like You can't ever have rules that are absolutely ironclad and have only one objective meaning that we all agree on in a tabletop role-playing game. And that's like a benefit of it being a tabletop role-playing game. We can play within the rules by having an interpretation that I think we can all agree as reasonable people discussing is a reasonable interpretation without needing to prove that it is a valid interpretation, because you can't do that. You can never do that. I hate to say it this way because I feel like you're being extremely reasonable. I want to push on this subject, though. That's why I'm derailing it with my maybe more than 2 cents. This is up to about a quarter, maybe, of opinion about this subject. I think it's great that you have an open mind to other people interpreting it differently. I am a little mad that this has happened enough that you would even feel the need to try getting around other people's, shitty interpretations of, this specific rules that much. It just doesn't matter if you are playing a good game. Like that it just is irrelevant if the playgroup is not disingenuous. But I thought it was really interesting the way that you pointed out the ways it may be misconstrued. And of course, were this a video game, or were the game to use united, totally stringent ruling, that is theoretically possible. Magic the Gathering is an example of a tabletop game that has attempted to have, like, programming code-like syntax that means things objectively mean a single thing and are not up to interpretation. You could do that. Pathfinder just doesn't do that, is all I'm trying to say. It tries but fails, is my interpretation. 5th edition tries but fails really badly, in my opinion. But yeah, anyway, there's more I wanted to talk about. I think the idea of this being a matter of balance is where I was going with that. If it were a video game, we could then go further and ask, okay, but is it good balance to require a stringent interpretation of, snapping flank and similar teamwork feats? Or would it be generally better balance to provide a more lax interpretation, lax restrictions? If it were a video game, you could imagine it being, we pick the strictest or the least strict reasonable interpretation of these rules, and we implement that. The least strict being basically anything that lets you share the teamwork feat counts as them possessing it. Regardless of how it shares the feat, that works. Or the game has the most strict interpretation. It has to specifically occupy, I like how you said, a permanent feat slot to count. And you could have a separate discussion that I would argue has practically nothing to do with the actual tabletop game Pathfinder about whether it would be interesting to balance the game to allow or disallow those things. My thesis for this little end part of the parlay, in exchange for spending 25 cents of your $9 parlay on my stupid side tangent about how people are being pedants, and I think you're being totally reasonable, and I actually really appreciate that about this parlay. My interesting thesis I want to add here at the end is that I think almost all games benefit from using a more general interpretation of these ideas. The only problem that arises is when the player, noticing that the trend is for a general interpretation of things, begins to make further lateral thinking, but then it doesn't work. That is, there really is no objective most general interpretation, and everybody will think a different point is a cognitive leap. I would argue that with talking in a community, discussion and thought, you can arrive at what will be the most common assumption of where beyond this is just not similar enough to count. But in game design, I think it is an open question to say, allowing the player the flexibility to fit pieces like this together, good. Where exactly do you draw the line? And so some methodology by which to do that would help. I think a lot of the time players really enjoy this idea that something feels like it would work with something else, so it does. I think that is a nice feeling in a video game, anyway. And from a programming perspective, I would argue this really isn't much harder to do. You could just apply the tag that means this ability turns on to more of the things you'd think to apply it to, rather than less of the things that it would apply to. So it's fine to do that from like a production perspective. I think my question is more about how you communicate that to the player. Now, a lot of tabletop role playing games, just start there, do have a section in part of their rules text that says, you can't exactly interpret the rules this way. You need to be prepared to make rulings. And the type of player that rules lawyers on the internet has conveniently sidestepped the fact that these games literally say in their rules book, if you wanted to be such a pedant, that you literally can't be a pedant. Like, the game requires that you do not interpret it that way. But we'll put that aside for now, since they won't stop doing it. In a video game, I can just say, no, the game developer, have made it my job to make a reasonable interpretation. So here you are, here it is. As is often my feedback for these types of situations, I think a good solution would be to just explain a corner case. Have the player gain, a lot of examples of teamwork feat use cases, and then a weird one that goes beyond the scope of what has been allowed in the game, and simply have a clause in the game, a pop-up in the game, that says why that doesn't apply. The logic from the developer, why that doesn't apply. I think humans are a lot better at thinking systemically than they give themselves credit for. People can be kind of insane sometimes about their ability to think critically, not transferring over to other things. You'll hear people who, work as surgeons say, oh, I'm not good with computers. I can't figure out Microsoft Word. And it's like, you literally can't. Like, you can't be smart enough to be a surgeon, a good surgeon, without being able to use Microsoft Word. That's like not physically possible. And yet you hear people act like this all the time. Now, if you force them at gunpoint to do it, they would be able to. Like, they are just wrong, but people think of themselves that way. They do. I have found that to be true anyway. And so what do? Well, as game developers, I am critical of people's behavior like that, but I'm here to help. And I think a thing that helps is to show them that, point out to them that you just figured out a kind of systemic way this system would work. Your assumption is just slightly different from the one the game takes, and that's reasonable, but here is the one the game takes. I think people are actually pretty good at doing this when you get them in the right moment. It's just when they're asked to be an authority, I guess, or specialize in something, that they magically turn off and claim to be terrible at everything except the one thing they've learned to do. In their casual time, I have found that that's quite the opposite. Players are actually really good at a wide variety of activities. And you will find them, very subconsciously doing this kind of amazing thing, systemically trying to approximate the game's programming logic, even. And that's awesome. I think all you need to do to go the extra mile is simply explain a little bit more directly how the game is using that logic. You could even do it in terms of role-playing. In a game, or in your tabletop role-playing game, you could say, these magic items will adapt to the will of the wearer, and try to find a way to connect in the way that the wearer is uniting them. But some things may just be too much of a stretch. For example, they might not interpret blankety blank as being exactly the same thing. Not everything counts as a teamwork feat, but a lot of things do. And you can be fairly loosey-goosey with your interpretations, a flavor of this, just as an aside, that I find kind of frustrating is sometimes games will say, oh, all technology, all steel weapons or whatever won't work or will work with this class or this ability or whatever. And it's like, okay, but you can make many, for example, you could make an automatic weapon as a thing that is not really technology. You can make an automatic crossbow with wood and rope and sinew and stuff, right? Is that technology or no? It's made of the same things as your club that you're using to beat people up. So does that count or not? That I feel like that kind of avoids the question. That feels like the writer is trying to say, oh no, my narrow interpretation of this word is objectively correct, and I simply don't care to think what other people would think of it. It's like, okay, but it's your job to do that, though. The players, while I think it's annoying when they don't think in a very broad-minded way about what other people would mean, at the same time, it's not their job to do that. So that's bad, but it's expected. Whereas from a game design perspective, it's like, no, your only job is to think about, how other people would interpret this thing, or at least make it cohesive for the player in some way. So it's something I would like to see games do more. I feel like your example of a build interaction here, EyePatchNotes, is one of the most like beautiful forms of making a build, where you really invent something, and it feels like you've taken pieces in a way they're intended to work, but combined them in a way that feels novel. And that could just is really fun. Like, it's the joy of creating things. And the idea that both player interpretations, when those matter, and also developer communication about those things when that matters, are usually really bad, is, I think, one of the biggest things holding back making builds like this. I, for one, am absolutely not in the same boat. I don't think it is doing game design in any meaningful way to not be strongly on the side of people trying to make this kind of build. I think that's awesome. So forgive me, I know it ended up being a $2 out of a $9 parlay that I talked about that, but I did because I think it's truly very related. I also got a little mad. This is a subject I'm a bit passionate about. I find it annoying that people shut down so much harmless, interesting creativity because they're not willing to think about why they would be so interested in it having some single strict definition, and think about, do more people than just me interpret the rules that way? And does it matter? Can't people have fun? Like, if you allow this, what would be the problem? And people have a tendency to just not go that far and to realize, oh, I think it'd be a problem because I have a player who wants to overpower everyone else at the table, and that player is just being kind of an asshole. That's really not a reason not to allow this mechanic in this discussion on Reddit, where we're talking about this guy's cool build. Like, I recall a player in my play group, this guy with this really cool build, who had been talking about it online. They had a forum that they participated in, maybe a Discord server, I don't really remember, but they said, can I use this at your table? I asked some people online and they said no. And I smiled a little and said, I'm probably gonna say yes. Let's see what it is, and they showed me it. And it was the most eminently reasonable thing of all time. It just, there was like a corner case where it's unclear, much like this teamwork feat example, where it's just kind of unclear. It depends how you interpret a almost deliberately unclear wording in the rules, whether or not these things would work together. But the only reason to say that they don't work together would be that you would be worried that the player would rules lawyer themselves into being overpowered. And that just isn't a problem in a table full of good faith gamers. So of course I said yes, and it was great fun. Like, that was awesome. It was a memorable build. Maybe we'll talk about that sometime. Anyway, rant end. Thank you for the intellectually stimulating parlay. A little dash of a little bit of spice, a little bit of salt. You put a lot of salt in hot sauce from time to time as a preservative. And I am definitely not one to add any more than the most salt. Looking forward to the next one. It's been fun to hear about this build. Hey, if you'd like to get parlay like this one, folks, you can do that using a link in the description. I'd love to have you. And EyePatchNotes, looking forward to the next one.